The goal of this podcast is to enable a better understanding of music as a fundamental part of Latvian culture. Viena balsi means in one voice for each guest, musicians, composers, performers, and one voice when people sing together and unite under one cultural identity. We are grateful to the American Latvian Association Culture Funds for their help. Don't forget to subscribe so you will never miss a single episode. And now, enjoy listening. Welcome on Viena Balsi. Today we receive composer Maija Einfelde. Māra Delesa-Vēliņa did the instant translation from French to Latvian in the original interview. We recommend the book by Jauns Laviete, which contains essential elements to understand Maija Einfelde's work. I find that your music sounds like no other in the world of Latvian composers. It has something very special, and yet at the same time, when I listen to you, I feel like I hear a whole part of history of Latvia through your music. I remember the first time I went to the National Museum in Riga. I felt the same fresh air when I listened to your music. I found the same enthusiasm like the first time I heard Maurice Ravel. So am I wrong in thinking that your music is at the crossroad between tradition and modernity? No, you're not mistaken. I believe that the most modern trends, what's often called the Darmstadt Cool and its subsequent offshoots in Europe, don't resonate with me personally. What matters to me, above all, is ensuring that emotion in music isn't sacrificed. That said, I do hope traces of my Latvian roots shine through in my compositions. Much of my work draws inspiration from Meingalit's Midsummer Eve, for instance. The Latvian landscape and our language hold such profound meaning for me. I strive to create music that conjures that distinct Latvian spirit, a sense of place and heritage. It's become particularly clear when I write choral pieces in languages like English or Italian. Even though the notes are the same, something intangible shifts. The Latvian essence I cherish seems to dissolve, and the result feels different. Take my sacred works, for example. I've composed many pieces setting biblical text, but in whose context? That Latvian undercurrent fades. Still, I find value in that process. Now, I'll admit my technical grounding reflects my upbringing. My generation studied behind the Iron Curtain, isolated from Western Europe's innovations. We discovered those developments much later. Whether that explains my stylistic preferences, I cannot say for certain. What I can emphasize is my commitment to emotional authenticity. I frequently anchor compositions to literary narratives, several of my violin sonatas, for instance, directly interpret plots from literature. Honestly, dissecting my own work feels awkward. My music should speak for itself, ideally through the interpretation of listeners and performers. There is something that strikes me that has marked me a lot since I listened to you, is that your music contains tragic things, but the darkness always finds an element of luminous poetry. And what I find the most striking is a certain sense of humor, something that is astute and inventive. For example, in one of your pieces for cello, one has almost the impression that the cello becomes a musical soul. These kind of small moments in which there is always a point of irony reminds me Prokofiev or sometimes the humor Shostakovich had. Yes, both of these composers remain deeply important to me, especially during a time where so much other music was inaccessible. Bartók, for instance, I hold his work in the highest regard, even now. His string quartets, to me, represent something like unattainable perfection. We couldn't access those pieces in my youth, of course, but discovering them later only deepened my reverence. Britten's influence has also been profound. He demonstrated that contemporary music need not rely solely on dissonance to make its mark. For my own part, I strive to preserve beauty in composition, not just technical spectacle. I've never cared for gimmicks, like treating instruments as novelties. Once, someone compared a cello sound in my piece to a saw, though I suspect that had more to do with the performer's interpretation than my intentions. I prefer to leave dynamic markings sparse in my scores, trusting performers to breathe their own life into the music. Fortunately, I've collaborated with extraordinary musicians. The Latvian radio choir, for example. Their interpretations often elevate my work beyond what I imagine while writing. I'm not shy about reaching out to top artists, and it's paid off. When the Boston Symphony Orchestra's Andris Nelson's programmed my Lux Eterna to open a concert, an American critic described the piece as ancient and modern and nothing in between. That phrase delighted me. It encapsulates exactly what I aim for. Yet, this recognition came late. Early in my career, I was either dismissed or outright ignored. Now, to hear ensembles like the radio choir performing my music with such precision and spirit feels like a gift. They sing it better than I wrote it, if I'm honest. Gratitude doesn't quite cover it, in fact. Perhaps I can specify something in relation to what you just mentioned, and which is directly linked. In Albuma Lapa, you have included the monogram of your name, and this is not the only piece where you do that. Something Shostakovich has done in Symphony No. 10, for example. Is it a process that was used like him to escape the censorship, or is it a reference to Shostakovich directly, like a tribute, or perhaps a process used by many composers at the time? Well, yes. First and foremost, I believe my musical signature is unmistakable in these works. There's a distinct intonation I gravitate toward, one that feels deeply personal. Take Shostakovich, for example. The notes D, E flat, C, B. This is his motives. My own monogram, E, F, E, F, shares a striking resemblance. Early on, critics questioned whether I'd borrowed it too shamelessly from him, but this sequence is inherently mine. I've always been drawn to its flexibility, how it can morph into countless variations while retaining its core identity. Age as a way of shaping perspective, my musing has grown darker over time, no doubt reflecting the trials I've endured. Yet, even in that darkness, I insist on a glimmer of light, a golden age to every storm cloud, as I like to say. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't think you've written a symphony. It's rather pieces for small musical ensembles. I have further questions about this later. Contrary to assumptions, I have written one, though I consider it as a misstep. It's been performed, yes, but I've never warmed to it. The same applies to my solo violin sonata. Magdalena Gecka included it on a recording, much to my bewilderment. While I respect her artistry, I'm not sure it is in that platform. In my opinion, it sounds very good. I propose now that we listen to one of your cello and piano sonata, an extract from the album by Magdalena Gecka und Iveta Zalite. This is the sonata number 2, first movement. I have revisited many of my works across multiple iterations over the years. Take Ave Maria. It began as a piece for women's choir and organ, then evolved to include men's voices, transforming into a mixed choir arrangement. Later, I distilled it down to a solo organ version, but version feel like an understatement. The organ adaptation diverges radically from its choral origins. This piece holds a special place in my heart. Ausma Derkevica commissioned it for her anniversary, and it became her favorite work. When she passed away, I couldn't help but reflect on how composition outlive their creators. This fluidity extends to other works too. One-string quartet exists in so many reimagining, reworked, rearranged, reborn. Then there is Adagio for organ, which I have adapted endlessly. I joke that the one only format missing is a rendition for balalaike. Yeah. Alors justement, c'est ma... So this is going to be my next question. There are things that are very unusual configurations of instrument even now. At the time it was composed even more awkward. For example, in your choral work, Lux Aeterna, there is a vibraphone. For me, this combination works, obviously, but I am under the impression that it was considered as something very bizarre. Or another example, your concerto for 4 clarinets, which became a piece for organ, is it among the reasons why your music was so misunderstood, in your opinion? Lux Aeterna, yes, there was a vibraphone, and there was even a large section in the middle without the electrical part. The vibraphone was unplugged, and it revealed a harder sound in the middle frequencies. Sigvard Sklava asked for campanella bells, which he had it. Well, I have to say, I always like to complicate things a little bit. I have a song on my album, My Childhood Home. There, for example, I took the liberty of using a harp. There is a harp and a clarinet, and the bells. And so the performer, poor thing, has a difficulty. To some extent, I am signing the deaf warrant for the piece, like when I use the harp. Because if they are on a travel, it's not that easy if you have this kind of lineup. But nevertheless, I have a permission, I always talk to the performers before, and the work is created afterwards for a particular performer. So then I am given the permission. But then once I wrote a little piece for the Liepāja Symphonic Orchestra, where I put a trumpet solo. It is a very dear instrument to me, the piccolo trumpet. And they told me they didn't have a harp and asked me not to add it in because otherwise they have to buy it to call an harpist. Orchestra does not have one. Well, if they don't, they don't. That's the story with these other instruments. But I always like to think of something like that. I like that vibraphone immensely. The large middle section was for the vibraphone solo and only some scream for the choir, roaring. Well, I thought Lux Aeterna is, however, related with the dead. If it is related with the dead, then this is something peculiar. But Sigvard Sklava took the piece, he didn't find it convenient, and very successfully he got rid of the whole middle part. And in a sense I am grateful to him for that, because with that extensive vibraphone solo, they could not have performed it so much at all. Whereas now, this piece has been sung a lot in Sweden and elsewhere by the radio choir. But that's the way it is. As soon as you pick at some unusual instrument like the celesta, then there's immediately a problem.
tikko tu paņem kaut kāds instruments, piemēram, arī tāpat čelesti, tad visreiz problēma.
I have a celesta in one of my pieces. Probably in the orchestra there is a celesta now, but sometimes there's not. And then they are reluctant, so to speak, that's the way it is.
Un tad viņi nelabprāt, tā sakot, tā tas ir kādreiz.
So it turns out that those unusual lineups come around with particular musicians in mind?
Yes, exactly. I talk to them for collaboration. Moreover, there is an instrument that I don't know that well. For example, clarinet. I've been writing a lot for the clarinet, but again, because we had a very good relationship with the late Gert Spage. And then he showed me everything you can do on this instrument, where you can get an interesting tremolo and what else not. I'm usually working very closely with the performer. Recently, Jānis Porietis recorded a CD, and I have this little piece for the trumpet solo. And then Porietis showed me he has all sort of mutes, something like 10 or 15. And it showed me how the sound of a trumpet changed completely, and you can't even tell that it's a trumpet anymore. And then there was this moment where he showed me this one of airy sound, like not of this world. And since I had dedicated the piece to my late sister, she passed away. She was an alpine skier and she passed away exactly in the mountains. And the piece is called Star Mountain. It's recorded now too. And then Porietis was quite surprised. He said, well, a person of such old age, yet is all in discussion and listens to what the performer might suggest. I've always liked it that way. And then there is also French horn in quite a lot of my pieces. By the time I was working in a music school, and I had a French horn player, a very good boy, a boy who studied with our great French horn player Valdis Clichan's. And so the boy showed me all sort of tricks that you can get on the French horn. And his teacher said, don't show her, you show and then I have to play at the concert. I am under the impression that you were really ahead of your time, because, for example, I receive Gundega Schmidte, and what she does with musicians is that she makes sessions where she records all the possibilities of in the instrument in terms of sound that the performer provides. I haven't gotten that far with that. I haven't made recordings. However, they play very willingly, very often. Musicians love collaborating with a composer, and moreover, I allow them. I give very little dynamic marking. I give very little guidance, in fact. I say, you can play fast or slow, loud or soft, just please don't change the notes. The pitches must remain. The ones that I've written down, the rest you can do as you please. And they are very happy because they say it gives them freedom and fantasy, and they feel they are co-authors. And I love that too. For example, Eric Kirchfeld's, in my cello sonata, he says he can play differently each time, and it's new for him every time because I don't push on with my demand. But he has to play like this and that, and he can't play any other way. The only rule is not to play other notes. So I imagine these were painful moments, but maybe now perhaps we begin to have elements of understanding. So how do you explain that so much of what you wrote was refused in the 60s and the 70s by the Association of Composers of Latvia? Baiba Jaunslaviete mentioned it in her book as well. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Because, for example, I was very pleased at the time that Magdalena Geka took those violin sonatas of mine. They were written in the 80s and then they were a punching bag. They were never played except for the Composer Union. Every year there was this so-called plenum or congress. They were performed there, and after that, nothing. There were musicologists who didn't tolerate me in general and still don't do to this day. I don't know, maybe that's because I suppose that maybe my music is a little too much, well, it's a music that is demanding from the listener, from the performer. Maybe it breaks in there a little too much, too intrusively. That's what is not tolerated usually. I'm trying to be too much, well, I don't know, there is something about it that repels, I guess.
Maybe it induces too much emotion so the person can't bear it.
I am maybe breaking in somewhere, let's say, as a psychoanalyst might do, yeah. Somewhere, well, where you should have more of distance yourself. Similarly, as Bartók is also very... The music is tense, but it does keep a distance. It doesn't intrude you with his emotions. Shostakovich a little. Schnittke often is too overwhelming. Listener starts to wave off. I think that's a problem, that I am doing it too emotionally. It's the emotion. I know the performers also sometimes complain that they're having a hard time. For me, the music is hard to be conceived and it is hard to listen to.
Yes, I understand what you are saying.
You were singing as well this composition called Free Songs and you were not particularly happy with it.
Well, I couldn't say that. Rather, I personally find it technically difficult to sing them. And if you can't do it technically, of course you will get angry.
Sigvard Sklava told me that in Siren Highland, one of his very good radio choir singers flung the partition right on the ground out of the anger that she was unable to make it.
This is not just emotion here.
Siren Island is very, very difficult.
When you can't do it, you can't do it.
And secondly, it is especially when there is some internal tension, where I have a very high emotion myself, often depression. And it is also because, I guess, I don't pretend to be someone else. I am being very true. So it's probably found in the pieces, and it is depressing. I was once told by Bulayeva Larissa, when she was playing half an evening with my music, like my crucifixus for the organ. Depressing, and I would rather not to do that anymore. Now, at my old age, I'm striving to get more of light in my music, but somehow, I guess, if I want to be truthful, well, I think I can't. But at the same time, there are very conflicting emotions inside your music. Yeah, you're right. But I'm trying to get the listener to take a breath so that I don't intrude on him so much with my emotion. But precisely, this is exactly what I found striking about your music and who made me enjoy it. I propose now that we'll listen to one of your choir works, which is called Divas Mielas Dziesmas, the first track, Tas Divas Roses.
Jā, bet es saku, bet tas ir...
Yeah, but I can say that if I was like Peteris Plakidis, if I knew to be playful like him, I have always envied that, but I don't know, I can't do it that way. I must say, my performers also sometimes complain that it is emotionally and psychologically difficult. But it can be depressing, and the main thing is that the music is, there's maybe the fact that it is sort of plain, old-fashioned. Nevertheless, in my opinion, the emotion is not old-fashioned. We had quite a different education in our time, not like it is now. There is a lot more opportunities nowadays to learn all sort of things. We were, however, living, and we thought that everything was... I didn't learn foreign languages, and I regret it deeply. We were told that whatever we would do, we would get along with the Russian language. But it was not the case, and somehow that Soviet depressing environment where you were constantly afraid that you would be denounced by someone, I don't know, it was different, and all of that has left a trace, unfortunately. We can be like that in the West, man is free. We were afraid all the time, these sort of things. That there should be a complaint about you somewhere, that you would be in trouble. That's how it was, very much. It takes a lot of hindsight to admit that, simply. Indeed, and that is also why the music is like it is, that there is constantly this emotion. This kind of emotion that, I know Schnittke has a lot of that. It does not lift you up. It's difficult.
Le
point commun que votre musique a avec Nietzsche, c'est que vous avez quand même, c'est très très varié. One of the things you have in common with Schnittke is that you don't have a single style of music, one style that would enable to identify you in an absolute manner. This is very diverse, and this is also something disturbing, maybe. When one listens to Schnittke, you realize that the choir work is one thing, his string quartet is another thing, and human mind is keen to get some label on things and feel insecure if he can't. I think that to some extent it is a flaw of mine. I fantasize that I could, let's say, do it in a more balanced way. Of course, I do have some pieces that are dear to me, for example, the aforementioned Iceland of Sirens. I'm pleased with it, but I have to say that if I could relive my life now, I would probably look at the world differently, because we live in absolute different circumstances. And besides, it is probably bothersome that one is being nagged constantly until the moment, I don't know, until the radio choir started singing my works, and thanks to Dace Aperane, I sent my Prometheus, the chamber oratorio, to Barlow Endowment for Music Composition. It was only after that when I started to believe in myself. Once I gained the top prize there in a decent competition, because until that I thought I was just, I had no faith in myself. After that, somehow it became easier to live, and then all of a sudden everybody was nice to me. I was given the Latvian Grand Music Award instantly. All of a sudden I turned into this, acceptable composer. I was not picked at anymore. But precisely, when I listen to you, I hear something that remains of that period. Something very severe towards yourself and your work, to the point that apparently during these years you destroyed some of the scores you wrote. I find this terrible. Yeah, a lot of them, and I regret it now deeply. I imagine also being a woman played a role in that. Some men would have allowed themselves easily, I suppose. Of course, first of all, I took it too much to heart, so to speak, when I ripped my scores apart, all of them. Secondly, I did get to suffer a little bit from it, because my dear professor said, "You are gifted enough, but you are a woman. Nothing will come off." That's what he said. But I believe he was right to some extent about women.
At that time, it was a general attitude, I guess.
But I believe, to some extent, he was right about women. It is not a woman's calling to compose. Why do men do that thing so much better? Likewise, the writers. For example, me personally, I can't stand works written by women. I don't read those. I dislike them. The woman is somehow too emotional, perhaps. I don't know. A man has a broader scope, however. I don't like women conductors of symphony orchestra either. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about that.
Well, yes, as women we are criticizing ourselves too often.
Indeed, too petty. A man oftentimes doesn't take it too hard at all. For example, it can be awfully bad in an all-female collective. Squabble amongst themselves, it's like that, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Yes, as I would say, there were some truth in what Yanis Ivanov said. And I certainly had to work more diligently and harder, so to speak. Elbow my way through. If I had been a man, it would have been much easier for me. Now we have got used to it. Now the girls are excellent. However, if we look in history, there aren't that many famous female composers. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. Unfortunately, and that is logical, her mind wasn't made for that. A composer, I think, has to be very difficult to explain. Composing is difficult in itself. You probably know that yourself. You must have a wider scope, and I really don't like women writers, unfortunately. George Sand, I can't stand that, excuse me. Nevertheless, were there some people to support and encourage you to pursue your work? Some teachers or some composers of the same generation, like Peteris Vask, for example? Yeah, Ivanov, the aforementioned. But why do a composer compose? Because he cannot not compose. Without a doubt, this is a perfect answer, yes. Yes, he always supported me very much, and likewise is very fond of Onute Narbutaite, the Lithuanian woman composer. He likes her very much. But I think that we lack, though, is the ambition, maybe, that we can make something so, well, on a smaller scale. I'm not sure. There are women composers, many of them. But classical music, there are none, actually. Well, what did the Poles have? In general, let's say, however, it is men's profession in general. I mean, for a woman, she's too much It's the fact that she takes everything too much to her heart. She can be derailed, so to speak, except that I had at my time a sort of enormous stubbornness. If I was derailed by some horribly unfair criticism, then I was angry for a few days, and then I was obstinate to prove to everybody and to myself, even in spite of myself, that I can still do it. And it's not pleasant having to constantly prove something all your life. You have to justify yourself. If a man writes a bad piece of music, he is simply out of luck.
Bet sieviete, jā, tā ir sieviete. Tāpēc ļoti bieži tā ir.
Yes, this is sad. I would like to hope that it is not like that indeed anymore.
It's not like that now, no. At the music academy, the girls oftentimes knock over the boys, but when I was studying, still, well... How many women are there in Latvian music? Not that many. Well, today there are, yes, today there are good female musicians, good female composers. But in my time, I think it's just more difficult for women. It is harder to concentrate, to pull herself together. It is harder to be focused. That's the real cause. Then it's her family, she has to think about everything. She can get it together, she's not as focused, but it's not her fault. She's not made that way. Yeah, but...
Yeah, but that's not a bad thing. Maybe it means there is less output, or it's different, but it's not inferior. It is the emotions which are more important.
Yes, but still, if you have to fight for yourself constantly, it is not right.
First of all, it takes too much energy. The energy one could put in creative work.
I think nobody likes bad reviews, even Prokofiev, who sort of behaved ironically, yet he was very hurt by bad reviews. I learned it reading his autobiography. One can hear and listen to you fighting and this reaction inside your music, like you don't want to get shrinked and narrowed in your creativity because of some preconception and pre-made forms that are the standards in music. Maybe I sometimes like the discipline in terms of the form in my work. I know that. It is some sort of free form, and I've been hammered a lot for that. Too by the music critics. But that's the way it is. I often have too much material. I propose now that we listen to a piece for clarinet, viola and piano, which is called Pirms saules rieta, which means before the sunset. Could you tell us what was the trajectory and process that led you to become a composer? In fact, I didn't start learning music until I was 13. I lived in the deep countryside, in great poverty, and then my cousin took me to Liepāja. I had an ear for music, and she herself was a young girl. I studied in Liepāja for 2 years, and then I went back. I went to Limbaži music school. For how long did I went there? I don't remember exactly. I guess while I was in 8th, 9th and 10th grade in high school. And Then I joined Tsassis Music High School, because for Medini, the music school in Riga, by the time I was not yet at the level to go to Medin's music school. I wanted to be a pianist, and yet, so to speak, I studied for 2 years in Tsassis and I joined Mediņš then. 3 years in Medini. And then by the 3rd year I entered the conservatory. I didn't have any particular difficulty with getting in. In Medini I had decent teachers, and then I studied with Ivanovs. But Ivanov was too, so to speak, great. He wrote his symphonies. He was too grand to care much about some girls just there. And then, thank God, I had the opportunity to go to Ivanovo for 10 years in a row. And there was a teacher in Russia. There was a teacher consultant either from Moscow or from Leningrad. And it was also extremely creative atmosphere in general. And if I did learn anything at all, I have to say it was there. Because here somehow, I think at that time there was no, well, how to say, we were deeply provincial here, in my opinion. At least in the Academy of Music, I mean. Peteris Vask, he was in Vilnius. He was a pastor's son, and he was not admitted as a double bass player in our conservatory at the beginning. Then he finished in Vilnius as a double bassist, and only then he entered our conservatory for the 2nd time with an entirely different polish and with another level of knowledge and abilities, of course. Also the fact that he was a string player, it is the basis of the orchestra. For him it was very fruitful. But now I think, nevertheless, I don't know what would it be like if he wasn't over there in Vilnius, and me, in turn. If not those 10 years in a row, thank God, this was something that Composers Union did me well. My compositions were not acknowledged, but at least every year, free of charge, we went to Moscow. You had to go, and you had to report for your work in Moscow afterwards. So you couldn't be a lazy bone in Ivanovo. You had to commit to work there. I went to Moscow, reported there, and strived to do my best. So my first pieces that I had, some of them were written in Ivanovo. The vocal cycle, if I remember correctly, named Colors, and the 4 elegies. It was quite really engaging there with those Moscow Leningrad consultants. They had a different kind of scope and concert life, however, and that different life outlook there in this big city. We did a lot, really, and there was above all the literature available. There was a very good music recording collection and a very good library. It was there that I first got acquainted with Marquez, Bulgakov. In other words, I had a lot of discovery, both literary and musical. That's how it was, and the main thing was that I didn't have to work in school that month, you see. Because if you work all day teaching harmony to brass players who don't want to learn in no way, then you are not going to compose anything. But there it was a whole month of liberty. You had your cottage and your grand piano, your instrument, and you just had to watch out to not miss the breakfast and lunch. That was the only worry you had. I was in cottage 8, where Prokofiev had composed his opera. And in this guest house it was Prokofiev's piano, right? I was in cottage 8, where Prokofiev had composed his opera War and Peace, and believe me or not, the aura was still there. It felt very special in that cottage. The same piano, most probably. His fingers would have been there, how wonderful. Yeah, and in the house there was nobody bothering you. You cleaned the rooms, the poor household women, they were sitting there and waiting for me to go for a walk or for lunch. They wouldn't dare come in while I was working. In general, the respect was enormous. So few of care, the rest was completely taken off one's shoulder. And if you're used to having to teach for 8 hours, aren't you, with harmony lessons to people who don't want to do that, who don't like the subject? For me as a teacher, there were many different situations. Andris Nelsons was one of my pupils. And he wrote such wonderful harmony exercise that it made me wonder. I thought, no, of course, he had made mistake at some point. But he crafted so beautiful modulation that I was thinking that it wouldn't have occurred to me that he could harmonize it like that. So it could be immensely satisfying as well sometimes. Likewise, like the Skrides sisters, Lauma and Linda. If there is a gifted student, there is a huge satisfaction for the teacher as well. Looking backward, do you find rewarding when you think you had such brilliant students as Andris Nelsons, Martin Williams or Caspar Adamsons? Yes, I've taught a lot of people for a whole year of solfeggio too. Silinch, he studied with me in Medini. He wasn't then a vocalist. I think he was a clarinetist then. I don't remember precisely. It's been more than 50 years for me working in those schools. Music high schools, I mean. I don't remember everybody anymore, but Caspar Adamson was very disciplined, good pupil. I was quite quick on giving 2s. It's a fail mark. That's what I say. I was often, so to speak, the tough cop. You know how it is. There is the soft cop and the tough cop. My last question, which is a question I ask to all my guests. As far as you can remember, what is your first memory attached to music or sound? My first memory was when I was 1 year old, sitting in bed, rocking here and there, and singing one popular revolutionary song, A Rise to Fight Working People, the Internationale. I remember this thing partly, yes. I remember that from the very beginning. I was very interested in music, and the first step for me also, well, it is a rather hazy memory, but still the fact that I've always liked music from a very early age. My mom played piano, and my first step when then led me out of a playpen supposedly had been towards the piano. It's a totally symbolic thing, so to speak. Yes, but you see, the whole house in Valmiera burned down, the entire house. And we were away. My father had died right during the war, and we had left for the countryside. Everything was destroyed by the fire. We were left only with the clothes on our back. And so the childhood was terrible. We were 5 children, and my mother was sick. My father had died, and we had nothing at all. So now who knows? My father was an organ builder, and he had a big carpentry workshop. Yes, probably if my early childhood had passed in prosperity and affluence, then maybe I would have been somebody different. Maybe the music would have been different. Thanks a lot for being with us. It was a very great moment, very mindful interview. If you enjoy listening to this content, don't forget to subscribe. You can help us on paypal.me/VienaBalsi. You can also watch interviews. Usually we film interviews on YouTube. Like, subscribe, and share these content on social network to help the growth of this channel, and you will be able to hear from us very soon.